They say the eyes are the window to the soul, that vision can transcend sight. But what if I told you those very same eyes that reveal who you are can just as easily be tainted by who you are not? This is the dilemma one would find themselves in as sanity disappears. But succumbing to madness is not a sudden process, and while initially subtle, what starts as a crack eventually becomes a fissure. So what causes identity to falter, for the mind to unravel and the psyche to break, for the gradual descent to steeply decline? What causes madness to breed? The notion that the eyes reveal a person's inner state is nothing new. The sclera, which is the white part of our eyes, actually evolved for this reason, and it's one of the things that differentiates us from other primates. But what I find fascinating about this is how it highlights the link between our emotions and anatomy. Many studies have demonstrated how universal emotions are, and how, just through the eyes alone, we can tell what someone is feeling, which is important because madness is not a state that was documented in these studies. Yet if I were to pull up pictures or characters who have clearly lost their mind, there's a certain look that I think intuitively we would all associate with madness, which is why I think this recognition offers a clue. If we work backwards, starting by identifying the commonalities between different expressions of lunacy, maybe we can identify what it is that makes one go insane. Speaking of which, I want you to imagine what it would feel like to search for something that you lost a long time ago. Not an object, but a part of yourself. This is what I imagine Gollum is feeling in Lord of the Rings, a character whose eyes are vacant, but always scanning, searching, but always empty. Dissociation is defined as a detachment from one's surroundings. It takes place when a person no longer identifies with what it is that makes them, well, them. For Gollum, this detachment is palpable, and it's reflected in his eyes, where the struggle between his former self and his desire for the ring takes place. But this dichotomy is not one that has to be taken so literally, and can be thought of as symbolic for something else. Which is why, perhaps the best way of interpreting Gollum's state of mind, or just dissociation in general, is through a visual metaphor. The eerie yet related feeling of empty multiplayer maps. I'm far from the first person to make this point, but because deserted worlds are so vacant, they create this feeling of something that's missing. So when you start up and explore an old map, one that you have fond memories of, there's this overwhelming sense of loss that feels like you're present in a physical sense, but not truly connected. Like what once had life now has none. What once had a purpose now feels hollow. Sounds strange, but this is what the emotional process behind dissociation feels like. Like there's an alienation of the familiar. Those who experience this will feel detached, like something's different, even if everything is as commonplace, ordinary, and recognizable as it was before. And if experienced for a long enough time period, fragmentation of one's personality is often the outcome. This is what we see in Gollum, where the complex structure of what was once him has now broken down into its interconnected parts, rendering them unable to merge in a way that allows one to create a coherent experience of reality, leading to a disjointed, almost erratic filter for complexity, but more on that later. While it's clear that what could have caused his decline is open to interpretation, one factor we can be sure made an impact was his fixation on the ring, an obsession that resulted in isolation. When we think of isolation, most people would immediately picture someone by themselves, someone walking home alone, sitting in their room alone, or just generally someone removed from the world. But I think a much more sinister version of isolation is the feeling of being invisible. While we can all feel like this at times, White Christmas, an episode of Black Mirror, really drives this point home. In this episode, Matt Trent, the antagonist, is technically freed by the end, but as punishment for his actions, he's blocked by society, which means even though he can see the world, no one can ever see or hear from him. A fate arguably worse than death. Loneliness or isolation, however you'd like to refer to it, is an interesting phenomenon, because on one hand, one can feel lonely even when surrounded by other people, but on the other, one can also find joy even when alone, with the reverse also being true for both, which means there is something other than the act of being physically alone that contributes to how we feel. And aside from the obvious, like how the strength of our relationships factor in, I think the underlying culprit actually has more to do with how we manage complexity. The world is filled with data points. If we try to process all of this in its raw form, it would be overwhelming, which is why normally when we assign meaning to things, we use mental frameworks to simplify it, highlighting what's most relevant to us by organizing it into patterns. This is done to create stability, to manage complexity in a way that isn't overwhelming. But if something disrupts this pattern, depending of course on how severe it is, it can expose flaws in our understanding, not just in ourselves, but in ourselves in relation to the world. Experience this for long enough, or in a manner that's strong enough to change how you view things, and psychosis is a likely outcome, which is what I think makes the ending of White Christmas so terrifying. It's not necessarily just the isolation, but the inability to cope, the continuous flood of new information in the form of people that his mind can't meaningfully process, creating a form of complexity that he has no way to resolve or simplify. This is something, to a much lesser degree, that I'm sure you've experienced before. A common example of it is suddenly getting fired. As soon as something like this happens, it demands attention in a way that changes everything about how one would view the world, suddenly making them have to take things into account that they didn't have to before, usually out of necessity. While this is a form of complexity, it's an external one, born out of challenges imposed by the outside world. So what would happen if that complexity shifted inward and ended up as an internal struggle instead? This idea can be better understood through a different but related character, one whose circumstances are equally as chilling. Balder from the God of War saga. Building off the source material, Balder follows the same arc. He's invulnerable, impervious, and can only be wounded by one thing, mistletoe. But compared to the Norse version, there's a slight wrinkle in God of War's Balder that completely changes the dynamic. He can't feel anything, and I mean anything. He can't feel something hot or something cold. He can't experience pain and can't even feel the basic sensation of touch. This might sound intriguing at first as a way to live, free of suffering, but in Balder's case, it quickly becomes a curse, as this inability to feel robs him of any pleasant experience just as much as it does any negative one. And over time, he becomes numb, detached, and cold, something that's reflected in his eyes. The notion that our senses and the emotions that follow are used to interpret the world around us is well documented. But why this is the case is not. I mean, sure, in one way or another, everything can be traced back to the concept of the selfish gene. But from a psychological perspective, why does how we frame something matter more than what it actually is? As an example, why does barely passing an exam have a completely different meaning depending on what your goals are? If your goal was just to pass, you'd likely be satisfied, even if the mark is objectively bad. But if your goal was to do well, a barely passing mark can be heartbreaking. What is it that makes the difference? The answer, this time, lies in how we interpret things. Our world is one where the perceived meaning behind something is largely determined by us. This is part of what contributes to why there are so many data points. So to overcome the endless way things can be interpreted, perception allows us to simplify the world without sacrificing functionality, framing our understanding not by assigning meaning to things, but by eliminating the vast amounts of information that could change how something is viewed. This is accomplished through what is relevant to us at that time, which basically means it's filtered through what our goals or needs are. But what happens when the ability to simplify the world is removed? When the very perception that highlights what matters and what doesn't is dulled? This is Balder's situation. He lacks the foundation of human perception, and as a result, the internal filter we use to derive meaning from things, effectively making everything equally distant, everything equally irrelevant. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but it illustrates a critical point. The way we assign meaning to things depends largely on how we define our needs and goals. Without it, nothing feels worthy of attention, not the joys that give life flavor, nor the pains that shape our growth, which means it is the filter that keeps us sane. But this got me thinking, what if we flip this scenario on its head? Fortunately, there is another character in the God of War series we can use as a case study for this exact phenomenon. During the initial playthrough of God of War Ragnarok, I think Heimdall is a character that most people would dislike. And it's not like it's for bad reason. He is arrogant and pompous and disagreeable and all of those things. But after repeated playthroughs, I find myself more intrigued by his character. This isn't to say that I like him more, but more so that I sympathize with his circumstances. Heimdall has the ability foresight, which means he can read the minds and intentions of those around him, earning him the reputation of someone who can see into the future. This is a really helpful ability, one that would no doubt make him powerful, praised, and respected. So it's funny then that when we meet Heimdall, he doesn't seem to embody any of that admiration, and instead comes across as condescending, or more importantly, hateful, even to those he's aligned with. But I think there's a good reason for this. There's an optional piece of dialogue you can encounter when in Asgard, where Heimdall basically tells you what he's up to. He admits that he reads the intentions of everyone around him, and because of that, only ever sees the ugly side of people, the true intentions they hide for fear of repercussions. Due to this, he becomes painfully aware that everyone he encounters is deceiving, not only to him, but to themselves. Of all the characters I've mentioned up until this point, Heimdall's circumstances are definitely not the worst. But I also think it's uniquely isolating. In psychology, there's a concept called the shadow. It can be summarized as the darker aspects of ourselves that we repress, something we all possess. In Heimdall's case, since the social niceties and white lies that smooth interactions have been removed, he's basically always exposed to everyone's shadow all the time, enforcing a type of reality that constrains how he perceives things. As no matter what, all he ever encounters is overwhelming evidence to justify his cynicism. But here's the tricky thing about the shadow. Oftentimes, it leads to projection, which is when we see in others what we cannot accept in ourselves. Since Heimdall only ever sees deception, malice, and the intent of betrayal, it raises the question, how much of what he perceives stems from others, and how much of it is a reflection of himself? I have no idea. But what I will say is, I think projection is what's responsible for his downfall. Short-sightedness is something Heimdall is continually criticized for, with Odin even going so far as to suggest that he needs to think more before acting. The irony here being that his power, the one that is meant to grant him clarity and insight, is actually what's responsible for clouding his perception, since it establishes a pattern, where he equates a person's thoughts and intentions with the absolute truth, something that may not always be the case. I brought this up earlier, but one of the chief adversaries to stable mental health is emerging complexity, which is why you'll always hear this idea of the value in voluntarily approaching challenges. If you do this, you'll increase your ability to adapt to new circumstances by accruing a set of evidence in your capabilities. Evidence that changes the way you'll view complexity in the future. Heimdall never does this. He stagnates mentally, trapped in a worldview that prevents him from adapting. And it's why his power, the one that's supposed to be his blessing, is what ends up being his downfall. For all that can be seen through the eyes, the disconnection, isolation, numbness, or distrust, the clarity of some things contrasted by the obscurity of others. I hope I've made it clear that complexity is the binding tether, with what we see in the world and how we simplify it lying at the core of our sanity. Which is why I chose each of these characters. Every single one, in their own way, is a different example of a common response. I mean, sure, the circumstances are a bit extreme and probably not something you'll ever encounter, but the reaction to them is not, with each pair of eyes telling us a story, some withdrawn, others overwhelmed. All, however, relatable, and is why I want to finish off with this point. The world is complex, overwhelmingly so. There's so many different ways things can be interpreted that of course it can make one go mad. But perhaps that's also where our power lies, in our ability to reframe things, even if they are objectively bad, to dance on the edge of the abyss without falling in. Because at the end of the day, what is sanity anyway? Is it just the absence of madness? Or are we all mad, just in different ways?